Well, good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a fun, tabulous show today, I think, Niall.
Of course, Robby. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Let's get right to it. Vice President Kamala Harris was in Philadelphia for a CNN town hall where she faced questions from undecided voters. The event was arranged after Trump declined to participate in the second debate with her. While the whole thing sounded like it would be an easy layup for Harris, I think the campaign might be waking up with some regrets this morning. For example, let's take a look at this classic job interview question Harris was asked by one undecided voter. Watch.
What weaknesses do you bring to the table, and how do you plan to overcome them while you're in office?
That's a great question, Joe. Well, I am certainly not perfect, so let's start there. And I think that perhaps a weakness, some would say, but I actually think it's a strength, is I really do value having a team of very smart people around me who bring to my decision-making process different perspectives. My team will tell you, I am constantly saying, let's kick the tire on that. Let's kick the tires on it.
Or take a look at Anderson Cooper asking Harris if she's ever made a mistake.
I don't think I've ever heard the former president admit a mistake. A lot of politicians don't. Is there something you can point to in your life, political life or in your life in the last 4 years, that you think is a mistake that you have learned from?
I mean, I've made many mistakes. And they range from, if you've ever parented a child, you make lots of mistakes too. In my role as vice president, I mean, I've probably worked very hard at making sure that I am well versed on issues, and I think that is very important. It's a mistake not to be well versed on an issue and feel compelled to answer a question. Mm-hmm.
And here's one more where Cooper was asked about her flip-flop on the border.
Let's just fix this thing. Let's just fix it. Why is there any ideological perspective on this? Let's just fix the problem.
To fix the problem, you're doing this compromise bill. It does call for $650 million that was earmarked under Trump to actually still go to build the wall.
I am not afraid of good ideas where they occur.
So you don't think it's stupid anymore?
I think what he did and how he did it did not make much sense, because he actually didn't do much of anything. I just talked about that wall, right? We just talked about it. He didn't actually do much of anything.
But you do want to build some wall.
I want to strengthen our border.
In fact, the whole performance had CNN doubting her. Let's watch.
Well, I'll just tell you what I'm hearing from people who I have been talking to, and that is that if her goal was to close the deal, they're not sure she did that. And, some people have asked, is she being held to a different standard? Maybe. But that's maybe the world that she's living in.
When she doesn't want to answer a question, her habit is to kind of go to word salad city, and she did that on a couple of answers.
You think she'd be prepared to do this by now. What's a mistake you've made? Nothing. What's a weakness you have? Nothing. What's the first law you want to pass? Nothing. What's a policy difference between you and Joe Biden? Nothing. Over and over and over. Empty, empty, empty. If she were an animal, she'd be a duck-billed platitude.
To be fair, not everyone felt that Harris's answers had no substance. Here's one reaction from an undecided voter.
I believe it was you that asked the weakness question. What is your biggest weakness? And she brought up that she has people around her that she can trust, that she can get the answer from. In my line of work in IT, I don't expect everybody to know the answer. I expect them to know how to get the answer. And her specifically, that resonated with me.
What did you think of Kamala Harris's performance?
I thought that it reminded me of the old Kamala Harris, who I had found underwhelming back in the 2020 primary. Like most people who cover national politics, that was my first time really watching her up close. I had thought when she first launched that campaign back then, okay, this is kind of interesting. It's a woman, a black woman from the biggest state in the nation. She seems perhaps quite charismatic. And then that campaign just sort of petered out in unimpressive fashion. Now, this year, there was a brief phase in this campaign around the time of her wrapping up the nomination, the convention, the first debate, which I do think she won pretty clearly. And I was like, oh, has Kamala Harris, improved when no one was watching while she was vice president? And I watched that last night and was like, no, she hasn't really. It's the same person.
Yeah, when she's asked, what are your mistakes or what are your regrets? I mean, she could say that the campaign I ran in 2019 and 2020 was to the left of where the country is, and I realize that now, and so we've revised some of our policies. I think that would be an honest answer. No politician wants to ever admit that they've changed the issues they're running on, but she clearly has, including when she was called out about supporting money for border funding and all of that. You know, I think what she's saying on that issue now sounds pretty moderate, pretty not divisive, and is reflective of the fact that Republicans are winning on the immigration issue, and that the mood of the country on immigration has shifted substantially to the right, or a rightward direction in public opinion on this is finally being noticed by people. And she has a fine answer now, but it is in contrast with the position she took on this several years ago. So I don't know if she reassured people that those are not. That's the danger with her. If
right.
if you're a moderate, between moderate and conservative, but you don't like Trump and you are willing to vote for Kamala Harris, but do you trust that this version of her is the real version?
Right, exactly. And you said about the mood of the nation on immigration. Now, whether that has changed, whether it has moved right, or a more conservative sentiment has been noted, the fact is that there is the suspicion with Harris that she is trying to comport herself or shape herself to fit the mood of the time, as she tried, having not been, frankly, a particularly progressive prosecutor back in 2020, around the time that there was I don't think the George Floyd thing had happened, but there was certainly a lot of energy behind Black Lives Matter and all of that. She sought to present herself in a more progressive light. And so it does get to this question of authenticity, and I keep coming back to that with her. I think one of the reasons sometimes she seems to lack passion and spontaneity is because she's a bit too focus group oriented. Yeah. And David Axelrod, who I think is, to be fair to him, one of the best commentators and not a particularly, so to speak, tribal Democrat, was kind of getting at that in that clip that we showed, that it can be this sort of platitudinous word salad thing to try to avoid taking really any definitive position and to try to preserve for herself kind of wiggle room on almost everything.
Yeah, we've all heard her now so many times say things that, yeah, word salad is a good way to describe it, or going to the... I don't mind that she laughs. There's nothing wrong with her laugh, but she does do a kind of nervous laughter when she's filibustering for time and trying to think of what she's going to say. Look, undecided voters are going to matter in the swing states. They're an idiosyncratic bunch because there are very strong feelings across the nation about Donald Trump. If you're truly undecided, you could be undecided for a bunch of reasons. Right. You could be undecided because you're the most conservative person ever, and you don't trust that Donald Trump is gonna. You didn't think he, took out the deep state. In fact, he fell to the deep state. So you're not. But Kamala Harris isn't speaking to you. Or you could be someone the other way, who's an actual progressive, right, who's really upset about Israel-Palestine, who thinks Medicare for all is a great idea and thinks that anti-immigration policies are xenophobic, and probably Kamala Harris is in danger of losing your support. Maybe you're a Jill Stein voter then. Yeah,
just two things briefly, Robby. When the whole Biden crisis went on, I think a lot of Democrats, including people that I spoke to, were like, we're definitely going to lose with Biden, but Harris isn't all that great, and I think that fear has been kind of borne out. And then just the other thing is that, having said all of this, and having said the traits in her political persona that I find kind of unimpressive, she's not out of this race by any means.
Of course,
the abortion question and the anti-Trump vote could be significant enough to get her over the line.
She is in most ways, and has demonstrated to have been an improvement over Joe Biden, given where Biden was. The only complicating factor of that is specifically the labor vote, I think, which is going to matter in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, where Joe Biden was better liked by this group of people, and that could end up hurting her. Yeah. That's my only concern for her candidacy. Otherwise, yes, she's reassured people because Biden was the situation with.
And I think she's going to do a bit better with younger voters than Biden would have done.
True. Right, we've got lots more to get to on the show today. In fact, we're going to continue talking about this town hall and the moment where Kamala Harris was asked if Donald Trump is a fascist. We'll talk about her response right after this. Vice President Kamala Harris has dropped the F-bomb. You know what I mean. Let's watch.
To General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted.
Harris even had a presser a couple hours ago, earlier, calling Trump unhinged. Excuse me. Let's watch.
Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable. And in a second term, people like John Kelly would not be there to be the guardrails against his propensities and his actions. Those who once tried to stop him from pursuing his worst impulses would no longer be there, and no longer be there to rein him in. So the bottom line is this. We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power. The question in 13 days will be, what do the American people want?
Reacting on X, the Trump War Room account wrote, quote, Kamala, increasingly reeking of desperation, is closing her campaign not by talking about the issues that matter to Americans, but by calling President Trump a fascist. Fox News contributor Ari Fleischer wrote, quote, Harris calls Trump a fascist, then she decries division and says how important it is to work together. This woman is a complete phony.
And in a viral tweet, one ex-user, Michael Freeman, wrote, quote, I'm torn. On one hand, Trump's former chief of staff says he's a Hitler-admiring fascist who wants to rule like a dictator. But on the other, Harris can't locate pay stubs from a part-time job 40 years ago. What a perplexing decision.
I'm not sure those are the only stakes in this election. So I was interested to hear her come out and say it. She was asked very directly, and she did not hesitate at all. She said she thinks Trump is a fascist.
She did. And, you know, here's the thing. That word obviously engenders all sorts of debate about what the precise definition of fascism is. Yeah. I think it is objectively, plainly true that Donald Trump has authoritarian tendencies. We look at the attacks on the media. We look at the suggestion, which he makes quite openly, that US attorneys could be fired if they didn't prosecute people at his behest. He talks constantly about using the justice system to take aim at his enemies and sometimes to protect his friends. And of course, we talk about January the 6th. So is he a fascist or is he not a fascist? He's pro-authoritarianism, plainly.
Yeah, I'm in a difficult position because I don't really want to necessarily defend Donald Trump, who I do think has authoritarian tendencies and is not my favorite person to take over. I think there are also a lot of authoritarian tendencies just amongst our people in government in general, including in the Biden-Harris administration. And I try not to use inflammatory language when I describe them. I remember, right-wing people will say Biden is a communist, Marxist, socialist, etc. Right. I'll be like, well, he's not a communist. Right. He's not a Marxist. A Marxist is someone who believes that it is inevitable the working people of the world will form a stateless, pleasant, perfect, will seize the means of production. Like, this is not, I don't think Biden's thinking is that precise. He has governed in a way that is much more progressive than previous Democrats. The Democratic Party has become more left, not on every issue, but on a lot of issues.
But sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, but there's a difference, though, between being more or less progressive and being authoritarian. I mean, when you say people in the current administration have authoritarian tendencies, in what way are you thinking specifically? I mean, and in what way does that parallel what Trump did or what Trump says?
I mean, we lived through a pandemic where the entire country was locked down, where businesses were told exactly how many customers they could have and at what times and in what circumstances they could enter the premises.
But that was mostly when Trump was in the White House, though.
Well, which is why I include him on the list of authoritarians. But this was under blue state governance. It was significantly worse. There is a bipartisan tendency to make war completely independent of Congress, with very little input from Congress. All over the globe, there is the routine violations of free speech and civil liberties we see under both parties. And then there's calls for, you say fighting with the media, there's calls to just transform our very institutions, whether it's abolishing the Electoral College or the Senate, adding seats to the Supreme Court, doing term limits for the Supreme Court, vast changes to the structure of our governments coming out of progressives. And I don't really think, I think that's fine. I don't agree with them, but I wouldn't. I tend not to say, "Oh my God, that's so radical and so beyond the pale."
I have two thoughts on that. Like, fair play to you for saying the thing about, like, you know, communism and all that, which is just a very ahistorical slur that gets thrown. I suppose my issue really, Robby, is like in the person of Joe Biden or in the person of Kamala Harris, I don't see the traits that I see in the person of Donald Trump. And that's not even that much of a partisan view. Like, I don't see those traits in Mitt Romney, for example, or Nikki Haley. But I do think that Trump is an almost uniquely dangerous figure because of his propensity to just think that what he wants is firstly should automatically go through any kind of guardrail, and is also just indistinguishable from, if you attack me, you're attacking America, that sort of stuff.
Although, you know, Fauci said, if you attack me, you attack the science. Trump, in terms of the things he says, is so outside the norm of him, and I've said this a couple times this week, so nothing new, but I agree, is very outside the norms of American politics. And also his behavior with respect to losing the election was, and that was a lot of it was things he said, but also is some actions that, yes, is very bad and very outside the norm. He did not govern in a way that comports with fascist government, right? There was not rounding up of undesirables. There was not the corporate sector being ordered by the government to serve wartime production, right? It was not a Nazi takeover of our society or institutions.
I know that
he says crazy things, but he says crazy things because he's a reality TV star.
Yes, well,
not because he's he's read Mein Kampf and understands the philosophical underpinnings of a fascist movement.
Well, that may be.
This is not an endorsement at all. Obviously, I'm not. But
the thing is, like, this is, I think, where we get into the difficulty, because then you get into like, well, did he govern as an actual Nazi?
Yeah.
No, he didn't.
I mean, what policy? You said Mitt Romney's not.
Yeah.
Clearly not a fascist, and I agree. What would have been so different about in terms of policy, in terms of the way the country was governed under if Mitt Romney was president from 2016 to 2020? Like, what would have been different?
I mean,
I don't know.
I mean, I don't think Romney would have done the Muslim ban for a start, right? That's something that would clearly have been different. I don't think Romney. Do we count January the 6th?
I think we might have ground troops in Ukraine. I think that might have been the difference.
No, but I mean, that is true. But that's a separate argument about whether you want a more isolationist or more interventionist foreign policy. That's a different question from Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies, which I think are quite clear.
All right, you tell us what you think. Coming up on Rising, what does happen if Donald Trump declares victory early on Election Day or Election Night or next morning? We'll talk about that. Stay tuned.
Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign is prepared for the possibility that former President Trump quickly declares an early victory on Election Night, even if the outcome is not settled in the swing states, as Trump did in 2020. Harris was asked about this scenario during an interview with NBC. Let's watch.
We are sitting here 2 weeks away from Election Night. Last election, the former president came out on Election Night and declared victory before all the votes were counted. What is your plan if he does that again in 2 weeks?
Well, let me say this. We've got 2 weeks to go. And I'm very much grounded in the present in terms of the task at hand. And we will deal with election night and the days after as they come. And we have the resources and the expertise and the focus on that as well.
So you have teams ready to go? Is that what you're saying? Are you thinking about that as a possibility?
Of course. This is a person, Donald Trump, who tried to undo a free and fair election, who still denies the will of the people, who incited a violent mob to attack the United States Capitol, and 140 law enforcement officers were attacked. Some were killed. This is a serious matter.
Now, the reality is that not every vote will be fully counted by election night. And as with 2020, if the race is close, it might not be decided until days after November 5th. According to NBC, several Trump allies predict that he will pull a repeat of 2020 and quickly declare his victory on election night. The move could signal to Trump supporters to be skeptical of the votes coming in and lead them to label the election as fraudulent. NBC writes that an early declaration of victory could be facilitated by what's known as a red mirage. That happens when Republicans appear to have a lead on election night because in-person votes are generally counted quickly, and that tends to be when Republicans vote. But that lead could disappear in the days after November 5th as absentee and early voting ballots, which tend to lean Democratic, get counted.
Meanwhile, top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, Representative Jamie Raskin, is panicking over Trump's failure to enter into certain agreements with the Biden administration for the presidential transition process. A letter sent to Trump and Vance, first obtained by NBC, Raskin wrote, quote, "Your actions depart from well-established norms of the federal government and demonstrate a spectacular disregard for the successful continuation of the essential institutions of American democratic government." My prediction is that regardless of who wins, the other camp, some people in it are going to say that the election was unfair and fraudulent, as has actually tended to happen in several of our close elections. It was not as big a thing in 2008 or 2000. 2008 was a blowout, so that was the closest thing we've had to a blowout in however many decades.
Yeah.
2012 was closer than that, but maybe not close enough. But 2004, there were people in the Kerry campaign who said it was fishy. I can't remember what state it was they got all upset about. There was
Ohio, I believe it was.
It was Ohio. They all got all upset about. And then, of course, 2000 was actually a genuinely disaster where the winner was not clear because of the ballots being screwed up in Florida. Right. This election is going to be just as close, probably, if not closer than the last two elections. And so I predict there will be lots of people saying, no, you didn't win, we won, no matter who it is.
Well, I think that may be true, but again, we get back to Trump has never conceded any election that he has lost. Going back all the way to the Republican primary in 2016, Ted Cruz beat him in Iowa. He immediately claimed that there was some sort of chicanery going on there. And I think the reason, to be fair, that concerns are so acute this year is that back in 2020, there had been people publicly, I think including Steve Bannon, publicly saying that the plan was for Trump to declare victory as soon as possible, and then you would do what we alluded to in the introduction. You would then frame what was not that surprising, Democratic votes being counted from the early vote and from mail-in voting, as in some way fraudulent. And that's basically what happened. To make a sort of larger point about this, one of the things that frustrates me about the fictions of election fraud in 2020 was there was nothing surprising about the result in 2020. If anything, Trump did slightly better than the polls had predicted.
Yes, that was the surprise.
He did
better.
But the idea that there was something so obviously suspicious about what happened isn't true. Republicans have a tendency to vote more disproportionately on election day. Democrats have a tendency to vote more proportionately early voting and by mail. And so that is reflected as the result.
Yes, and the Republicans, Donald Trump specifically, discouraged people from voting early or by mail and instead said to vote on election day.
Right.
So it was not surprising that it was like that. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I'm sure Trump will say whatever he's going to say, and then they're going to finish counting the votes. And if Kamala Harris won, she's going to be president. If Donald Trump won, he's going to be president. And I don't think either is going to successfully stand in each other's way. The efforts Trump undertook last time, they did not work. They were laughed out of court time and time again. I know there's a lot of panic that this time they've thought through this plan much more brilliantly and they'll be more professional about stopping the steal. I don't see any evidence of that.
I mean, the idea that we take reassurance from the fact that, it probably won't work, that seems rather thin reassurance to me when we have a nominee of a major party and a former president, and who knows, perhaps future president, if he loses, we just expect him not to accept the outcome. Like, that in itself is very troublesome.
I think it's troubling, but not enough Americans agree, because he was easily won the Republican nomination to be the presidential candidate again, and this election is super, super, super close. Mm-hmm. Tens of millions of Americans, hundreds of millions of Americans will be voting for Donald Trump, and they don't see that, or if they see that as a negative, they think it is overcome by preferring his policies on the economy and immigration with respect to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. It's just not the slam dunk. It's not knocked him out of political consideration for millions of Americans.
No, it hasn't. I mean, it has been a remarkable I hesitate to use the word political achievement because I think what he did on January the 6th and leading up to it was terrible. But to survive that politically to the point where he has, at minimum, a 50-50 chance of getting elected again is an astonishment.
It is Napoleon-esque. Defeated, sent to Elba, escapes, returns,
you're far too
gets the entire French military, shoot at your emperor if you will. No, they join him, and Europe has to come back together, do it again.
If we're going to
once in a century human being wielding this much power and influence over the development of human civilization.
If we're going to raise Europe, which you do and our commenters do on YouTube quite a lot when I'm on, I should just say, in British and Irish elections, we vote by paper ballot. You mentioned in 2004 there was a rumpus from Democrats who at that time were complaining about machine ballots. They were saying, oh, if you had paper ballots, none of this would happen. Now Republicans are tending to argue in favour of paper ballots because they're worried about Democrats or other foreign actors meddling with machines. I think you should adopt the European system, Robby, and have paper ballots.
As long as we don't use any more of those ballots that we used in 2000, the butterfly ballots.
Yeah.
Ooh, those are. Go Google it. Look it up. I challenge you to vote for the correct person on that ballot. It's impossible. All right, we've got much more Rising still to come on our show. Please stay tuned. We'll be talking about lots of interesting things. I'm not sure what, but I'll find out in just a minute. So get this. A government-funded study about puberty blockers for transgender teens went unpublished. Why? Because of politics. At least that's what the lead doctor of the research told the New York Times. Dr. Joanna Olson Kennedy spearheaded the $10 million research in 2015. It was intended to show providing trans adolescents with puberty blockers, drugs that prevent the development of breasts or a deepening voice, for instance, that would lessen depression and distress from gender dysphoria. Researchers recruited 95 trans teens from across the country, gave them these drugs, and watched what happened. Fast forward 9 years later, the results show not so good conclusions. In fact, there was no evidence whatsoever that puberty blockers improved the patient's mental health.
Dr. Olson Kennedy, a prominent trans advocate in the medical community, admitted to the New York Times that she withheld the results of the study because of the overall political climate. Quote, I do not want our work to be weaponized. It has to be exactly on point, clear and concise, and that takes time, end quote. Trans issues have been an issue on the campaign trail, with Donald Trump saying that Kamala Harris supports government-funded sex changes for inmates and illegal migrants.
The online community, including none other than Elon Musk, very riled up. The tech tycoon posted, Olson Kennedy is evil. Author J.K. Rowling of the Harry Potter franchise, who's been quite critical of the transgender movement, posted, quote, we must not publish a study that says we're harming children because people who say we're harming children will use the study as evidence that we're harming children, which might make it difficult for us to continue harming children. This does look pretty bad for activists on this issue. They did a study. It did not reach the result they wanted it to reach, and then they didn't publish it. That's like the opposite of good science. And look, I want people to really make these choices for themselves. I don't want government to tell people what to do here. I think if you're of an age to consent to this kind of thing, well, then it doesn't really matter. It's none of my business anyway. Obviously, the debate is over whether children who are below the age of consent, can they do this with their parents' permission in the medical system, and how much pushback and actually interrogating of their desire, because I believe there are young people who would be helped by this, probably, but also there are a lot of confused young people because having your body develop and go through puberty is difficult for a lot of women in particular, young women, and that this is not going to be the right choice for a lot of people. So if it's being recommended or pushed on people without really analyzing them and doing counseling and making sure that's the right choice, that's what I'm most afraid of. But here's a result that is not particularly favorable to this medical intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really defend this, at least on the basis of a pretty in-depth article from the New York Times, of all places,
Yeah.
so not an outlet that's going to be necessarily taking up the conservative cudgel on these issues. I mean, it looks for all the world like the person leading this research got results that she didn't like and then buried them. Now, perhaps she would have different things to say about that, although, as you noted, she's quoted in the New York Times story. Her argument is, in essence, that had the results been made public, they would have been used by people who are ideologically or otherwise opposed to what she wants. That just seems a crazy basis upon which to deny or to suppress, frankly, one's own research, especially when that research has been paid, at least in part, by public funds. So that's an additional problem in all of this. So, like, you know, I think the issue about, you know, gender identity and trans issues and all that, that is in a certain way, that's a different conversation, of course linked to this, but a different conversation. The issue here is someone saying, okay, I'm being paid to do research, I'll do my research, whoops, the results aren't what I wanted, well, let's just push those to one side, and I can't possibly defend that.
And there have been a couple studies now. There was information coming out of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, that there was some leaked documents there showing internal disagreement, same thing, not finding highly positive results from the use of puberty blockers. I know research done by some of our peer countries in Europe, including the UK, on this issue is they got a little cold to puberty blockers as well, because you're just not seeing the really strikingly positive results that activists on behalf of the transgender community expected or assured that we would see. Right. And you don't want to introduce a very invasive medical intervention, because they say that this doesn't have, you can introduce puberty later and then you'll go through if you change your mind and it won't have permanent lasting damage. That there is some, that's plausible, and then some people said that. There's also questions though about whether it will impact your fertility in the long run. I mean, it's a dramatic thing to do to your body.
Well, it is, and this is why I find it kind of odd that the liberal or left position on these kinds of issues has become so, well, I don't even know if so far to the left is the right way of putting it. I have pretty major problems with children doing anything that is not easily reversible, right? Because the whole point is that you don't have the maturity of adults to make decisions that are yours to make. That's why children don't have the freedom that adults do. So to defend from a left or liberal position the idea that, yeah, it's fine for this to happen to children, that seems odd to me. I don't quite understand what liberal position that is underpinning.
Some of these things end up being so inconsistent if you look by, and we're a nation of 50 states, right, where the policies are different in every state. The age at which you can get a license to drive, get married, get a tattoo, it's different in many states. I think sometimes it ends up being very weird if you can't you can't drive a car, but you could get married or something. In some other states, or you couldn't get a tattoo, but you could have major gender-based intervention or even surgery. Seems wild to me.
Well, and in this case as well, Robby, I mean, we say sometimes in politics it's not the fact, it's the cover-up that matters, or it's the cover-up that does you damage. And I suspect that could really happen in this case, not only for the reasons we've already outlined, but in this particular instance, as I understand from the New York Times story, the doctor is saying, well, the reason there was no improvement seen is that they were all doing fine at the start and they're still all doing fine at the end. But in fact, there appears to be data that the test group were not all doing fine at the start, that about a quarter of them were suffering from depression of one kind or another. So what's going on? It just seems, the whole thing just seems really suspicious.
Well, right, and that relates to the fact that having gender dysphoria or even being transgender overlaps significantly with being depressed or having mental illness, and also for people who fully have gender reassignment surgery, that overlaps with doing dangerous work. Sex workers are disproportionately transgender, and there's violence disproportionately against sex workers. So I'm often in conversations with people on the left who are saying, there's this unprecedented epidemic of violence against trans people. Like, if you look at the data, yes, they are statistically more likely to be victims of violence or murder, but it's not so much because there's like mobs of anti-trans people beating people to death. It's that selling drugs and being in sex work is very dangerous, and more people from this community end up doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which goes to show that there's a lot of fundamental mental illness or health problems for some, we were describing a minority of a minority of a minority here, but of people in this community, and this doesn't seem like an automatic fix.
No, and I don't want to make light of the fact that there is clearly anti-trans discrimination, and it must be terrible to suffer from gender dysmorphia and all of that. And as you said at the start, if people are adults, I think they should.
Yeah, and I'm not taking treatment away from anyone. It's none of my business. Do whatever you think is best for you.
Exactly.
I don't care.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right, we've got more to come on Rising today. Please stay tuned. Daddy's coming home. You've been a bad girl, and you're getting a vigorous spanking. Never thought I'd say that on TV. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Tucker Carlson at a Trump Georgia rally on Wednesday. Carlson compared Trump's prospective return to the White House to a dad returning home. Let's watch.
If you allow your 2-year-old to smear the contents of his diapers on the wall of your living room, and you do nothing about it, if you allow your 14-year-old to light a joint at the breakfast table, if you allow your hormone-addled 15-year-old daughter to slam the door of her bedroom and give you the finger, you're gonna get more of it. And those kids are gonna wind up in rehab. It's not good for you, and it's not good for them. No. There has to be a point at which dad comes home. Yeah, that's right. Dad comes home. And he's pissed. Dad is pissed. He's not vengeful. He loves his children. Disobedient as they may be, he loves them. Because they're his children, they live in his house. But he's very disappointed in their behavior. And he's gonna have to let them know. He's gonna have to get to your room right now and think about what you did. And when dad gets home, you know what he says? You've been a bad girl. You've been a bad little girl, and you're getting a vigorous spanking right now.
RFK Jr. was also part of the campaign rally. This is what Carlson said about him.
I never thought I would live to see the day when Bobby Kennedy would be one of the most beloved figures in a room full of Republicans, and Mr. Burns from The Simpsons and his criminal daughter would be Democrats. It's just absolutely wonderful.
So that's the pitch to vote Donald Trump. Harder, Daddy, harder.
Oh, Lord, I can't believe.
What are we even going to say about
going
this?
to discuss? I mean, that was some weird stuff. That was some strange psychosexual analysis there. I don't know. I think that would have been better left on a therapist's couch than in a rally. I noticed that it got a very euphoric reception, seemingly, from that conference. What do you say? Republicans are the daddy party and Democrats are the mummy party, supposedly, but that seems to take it to a whole new level.
Is that a thing that people say?
It is. Well, the idea being that Republicans are focused on sort of national security and toughness, and Democrats are going to take care of you by health care and education.
I had a political science professor in college who said that the Republicans were Jesus and the Democrats were Santa Claus.
Okay.
I can't remember what his argument was.
Presumably Democrats give stuff away, but I'm not sure what the Republican Jesus thing is, unless it's just Christianity.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, spanking, daddy, etc. It's interesting speech. Tucker says some interesting things from time to time. What can I even say?
I mean, it is just bizarre. I hesitate to...
It's okay to use colorful language to get a crowd excited, to use metaphor, right? This is not literal. It's not we're not breaking out the fuzzy handcuffs or whatever.
We can't. I don't know how far we can go down this road.
The whips and the chains. We're not on TV. We're on the internet, baby. We can do whatever we want.
Well, we can do whatever we want, but getting into sort of... And the fact that in Tucker's story, the metaphor was a girl being spanked, I don't know.
Maybe we can have a conversation about this. I think spanking is bad. I don't think you spank your kids.
Well, I'm glad to see that we're unified on the idea that hitting children is a bad idea.
Not with the hand, not with the belt,
not with anything.
not with a flail with kind of spiked ropes on it.
No, we both, and you see, this is where we agree, Robby. If that is, if adults consensually want to do any of those things, by all means, knock themselves out. Not literally, but enjoy it.
Sure, consent. What consenting presidential candidates do
behind
their ardent supporters is none of my business.
No.
That's fundamental to my libertarianism.
Will we talk about RFK becoming a new Republican hero or not?
Yes, sure. Let's move in that direction. Not just RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, I don't know if you saw that, has formally declared herself a Republican. I thought she'd already done that, but you get to have a coming out party every day when you've left the Democratic Party, when you've become an independent, and when you become a Republican. So,
she got to make it official. She's been. It's as if she's been in that home for a long time.
She did a party affiliation reveal party.
Yes, exactly.
Where we have I don't know, red doves or blue doves.
Not a big shock to anybody, mind you, given that her move from sort of liberal Democrat. I mean, she's always been a bit unorthodox, I suppose. But yeah,
right, unorthodox in a good way. I've been fans of a lot of things she's said over the years, and I'm supportive of some of the issues RFK Jr. has called attention to. It is interesting and notable that those two formerly perceived to be not just Democrats, but very progressive Democrats, crusadingly progressive Democrats on healthcare-related issues, environment-related issues, solidly kind of Bernie Sanders left people. I don't know that RFK Jr. ever said he was a Bernie Sanders person specifically, but really for the progressive worldview on the ability of government to grapple with corporations and things of that nature. Meanwhile, the Cheney family, the most viewed as the architects of the Bush-era Republican Party, the brains behind the operation, if brains is a correct metaphor for what was going on during the Bush years, have now flipped.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is an interesting realignment going on in various ways, and I think that one of the more interesting things about our politics at a very macro level is just the sense of these plates shifting and different groups and different people of different views aligning with a different party than one might have expected in the past. And obviously Tulsi Gabbard is part of that. I think I would be more skeptical of some of her positions than you would be, but I think that the breaking down of some level of party blind allegiance is a good thing.
Yeah, it definitely is. And people should move parties if they no longer believe in what that party is. The parties are now more ideological than they used to be, right? If you go back to the 90s and before, you had the most conservative Democrats were much more conservative than the most liberal Republicans, and vice versa. You actually had you still have liberal Republicans, I think, in state level politics. Often you have, in fact, very liberal or moderate Republican governors of blue states. That happens routinely. And every now and then you get a conservative, or at least a culturally conservative, a Democrat who can speak to who fits in with Republicans, who can win in a red state, although I think that's increasingly kind of rare.
Yeah, and a lot of those sort of moderate Republicans who had been concentrated in the Northeast have been kind of wiped out at
the House
level.
Yeah,
at federal level, state or Senate or House. A Jacob Javits kind of figure in New York wouldn't really arise now, because that's just not where politics are, I don't think.
Well, we are having fun on Rising today. I hope we have more salacious subjects to get into. Stay safe out there. More Rising right after this. Percentage of Americans who say they've got a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the mass media has fallen to a record low, according to a new Gallup survey. Now, when Gallup first started asking Americans this question in the 1970s, trust in the media was at 72%. This year, it's at only 31%. Now, media critic Josie Glabach, better known as the red-headed libertarian, says that this shouldn't surprise anyone. She blames mainstream media for peddling partisan talking points that the American people can see right through. She joins us now. She's also a co-host of Timcast with Tim Pool and is very active in alternative media spaces and online. Nice to finally get to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you too, Robby. Thank you for having me.
So we talk a lot on this show on Rising, as I'm sure you do, about the failures of the mainstream media and how they have gotten worse over time, how it has inspired a just broad lack of trust, not just from conservatives or libertarians, but from independents, from people on the left, from all sorts of people. It feels like someday I think the band of Americans who do trust the media, I'm trying to picture who they actually are. It's this smaller and smaller slice of American life. I say that could actually even be a good thing because, you look back to the times in American history where the media was well trusted. I mean, was good policy happening then because no one had the courage to call out BS from the mainstream media?
Yes, I agree with that. And, this actually goes back to the NDAA of 2013, where the Thornberry-Smith Amendment, it lifted the domestic dissemination ban. So this had been the Smith-Mundt Act had instated this. And what they did, they repealed and replaced the Smith-Mundt Act, and they put in the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, lifting the domestic dissemination ban, which allowed propaganda to freely flow through our country, again, for the first time since World War II. And if you think about when things really got crazy, and when you're watching the news and you're like, I'm being propagandized. My first time was when BLM came to the scene, and that was around 2013 or so. And I remember listening to the first coverage there and being like, I'm being propagandized. This isn't right. I'm being sold something right now. I'm not critically thinking about this. I'm being told what to think. And I think that a lot of Americans are waking up to this, whereas people, maybe you and myself, have been awake for a while. They're more waking up to this. And I think Elon Musk buying X and allowing transparency in citizen journalism to kind of come to the forefront has been leading the charge in that.
Yeah, and your moniker is the redheaded libertarian. You're a libertarian like myself. I remember realizing, when the revelation started to come out, that so much of the censorship and the bad moderation that we complained about on the platforms for years, and it always put me in a little bit of a difficult position because at the end of the day, they are companies. They can make decisions I don't like. I can complain about it, but I don't want the government to come in and start telling them how to do moderation. I know, even if that didn't it violates my principles, so I can't support it. And even if it didn't violate my principles, I know the government coming in to do that would not make things better. In fact, we know for certain it would make things worse. But then what we learned is that so many of those bad moderation decisions, so much of that censorship was not even being freely chosen by the platforms pre-Musk. People I don't agree with are in charge of Twitter, but they didn't want to do a lot of the censorship either. They fought behind closed doors with the federal bureaucrats bossing them around until eventually they gave up because it was just so overwhelming. I think that really was a light bulb moment for me.
Yeah, and releasing the Twitter files and finding out all the corruption that was going on behind the scenes. That was really, it's something we kind of all suspected. We're like, there's no way this could be happening organically. People can't possibly be like this. It was all speculation and it was all a conspiracy. But then we find out that it actually had been happening like that. And now we know on X there's a stop to it, but now we can look at other media. We can look at Facebook and we can look at Instagram and other media like that and know that, yeah, they're probably still being fed points from the government and coerced by them to shut down what we want to say.
And right now, that coercion is, in my view, taking the form of the war on so-called misinformation and disinformation. It's very reminiscent to me of the hate speech distinction that you'd hear from so many people that, well, I support, many progressives feel on the left, I support free speech but not hate speech, even though those are the same thing. Hate speech is well protected under the category of free speech. I think that same idea is being applied to misinformation increasingly, where you have tech bureaucrats all over the globe. They seek to do this in America, but they're somewhat constrained by the First Amendment. But elsewhere, using the so-called spread of misinformation on social media as the reason to do censorship.
Yes, and that's correct. And it's Kamala Harris had come out and she had said, we need a general rule for everybody because you're reaching all these people. And it's like, no, you don't at all. So back like in the founding of our country, our country was founded based on people being anonymous. All right. So the Boston Tea Party was spearheaded by some guy who went by Rusticus. George Washington had his spy ring and they were all numbered. He was 711. Ben Franklin wrote under Do Good. Sam Adams wrote under Vindex. And so our being anonymous and being able to speak freely is what kind of spearheads revolutions. And I think, in part, that could be why they're so afraid of the anonymity and wanting to censor that and wanting to call it misinformation and lead by fear in that regard. Because when people are afraid, they're more apt to give up their essential liberty for temporary security.
There seems to be this hatred of social media platforms coming from mainstream and elite thinkers and policymakers and media figures, because social media has allowed people like you and I who have departing ideas from establishment orthodoxy to speak up and be successful and disagree with each other and with the powers that be. And social media has has broken the guardrails forever. I think that's why we see so much discussion or appetite among policymakers for more tech regulation, things of that nature, because they know. Hillary Clinton the other day called for more tech regulation because if we lose control of the internet, then we lose actually using the words control. They know that they need that control in order to prevent criticism of their policies.
Yes, absolutely. So that's why we had seen recently that they were coming for Elon Musk. I mean, they're coming for him every single day, it seems like. But recently they kind of came out and there was the guy that works under Keir Starmer over in the UK. And he was reaching out to Kamala about how they were going to harass Elon's advertisers in order to kind of beat him that way. And that's so offensive as an American that they even thought that they could do that. But also it makes you wonder, why did they think that they could do that? Why did they think they could reach out to the vice president and person running for future president of our country and try to invade our freedom of speech and our freedom of expression and our First Amendment? Like, what made them so confident that they were able to do that? And I think that that's a question we should all be asking.
You can catch the rest of our conversation over the weekend. Josie Glabach, the redheaded libertarian, thank you for joining me.
Thanks a lot.
Gay Americans are often assumed to be Democratic voters since the Democratic Party supported gay marriage and anti-discrimination laws, and many in the Republican Party do not. But in this cycle, the Democratic National Committee is actually spending money on political advertisements targeting the LGBTQ community, desperately trying to keep them in the Democratic fold. The six-figure ad buy, which appeared in publications in major cities that target the gay community, show that the left is worried that this demographic might be slipping away from Kamala Harris's grasp. With us now to unpack this and a lot more is Charles Moran, head of the Log Cabin Republicans, an organization for conservative members of the gay community, many of whom will be voting for Donald Trump. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks so much.
So talk to us about this demographic, this community. I know many people will still hear the idea of a gay Republican and say, oh, that's like self-hating or something. It'd be like a right. Black KKK member. You hear that all the time. How do you respond to those kinds of insults?
Well, given the fact that the LGBT rights movement has been one of the fastest moving civil rights movement in American history, it's no surprise that we be brought into the same melding pot that the rest of this country has. So there's obviously, been so many advances over the last several decades. We're basically on parity now. We have, obviously the right to marriage, the ability to serve in the military. In so many places you can't be fired for being gay. I mean, we've essentially achieved parity. So with that, there's been an increase in gays and lesbians who are looking at quality of life issues as the rubric for their voting, more than just, are you an equality supporter or not? And that is all actually backed up in polling and in facts. Earlier this year, the Independent Center did a round of polling that showed for the first time a majority of gay and lesbian voters are actually going to cast their ballots based on issues other than gay rights, exclusively, which is a huge movement for this community because again, for the first time ever, the gay community can't be considered single issue voters. They're going to look at things like the economy, the foreign affairs, border security, and that is a huge opportunity for Republicans to step in, because on those issues, obviously Republicans are leading in the polls amongst all demographics of Americans. So, for context, in 2016, only 14% of the LGBT community voted for Donald Trump. That number doubled in 2020 to 28%, probably hits the low 30s. And again, now we're seeing this polling showing that with Donald Trump starts at 28%, but there's another 14 to 16% of the gay vote that is undecided, which could potentially jack Donald Trump's appeal and voter share for the LGBT community well up into the 40s. Now, if you compare that against other demographics like African American voters, women voters, Asian American voters, Latino voters, if you look at just objectively, more than a third, nearing half of any community voting in a bipartisan fashion, that's huge. And this is something that's not being discussed enough amongst especially mainstream media, but also gay media, because they realize that they don't have a stranglehold. I mean, the African American vote is substantially smaller for Donald Trump and Republicans. Same thing with the Latino vote, but so much more attention is being played to them. But in this situation, we actually have good data that shows that the gay vote is actually fairly split. Obviously, Democrats are still pulling from a higher level, and we all understand why. But it's not something that Democrats can take for granted. And to your point, this is why I think they're putting so much money into an ad buy directly targeting gay voters.
What role do you think Donald Trump specifically and personally has played in this? Because this was the first Republican candidate who I think we can admit comes from a more, it was not a religious conservative, right, social conservative type person, was clearly supportive of gay people and gay relationships earlier, before he was a Republican political figure. And I think even people who are ardently social conservative would probably admit that he still harbors those views, and he has not tried to turn the party back in a direction to not accept the decisions made by the Supreme Court in the states about gay marriage. Right. So is it really Trump himself who helped accomplish this?
I mean, Donald Trump gets a lion's share of the credit for this. To your point, he was the first president elected in American history who, when sworn in, actually supported marriage equality. Bill Clinton did not. Barack Obama did not. So this is actually quite monumental. Also, another first for Donald Trump is in 2020, he created the first ever official LGBT coalition on a Republican presidential campaign. That same year, Log Cabin Republicans, my organization, ended up raising money and helped put on the first ever LGBT outreach campaign on behalf of a Republican presidential campaign in history. And I think that that's in part why we doubled that vote share between 2016 and 2020. But even if we look at straight into 2024, look at just what recently happened in July at the Republican National Convention, where Donald Trump and the campaign single-handedly ensured that the newest approved official RNC platform stripped out all of the anti-gay language and left in place very common sense policies and some guardrails around LGBT issues. This, I think, is part of the reason why the Democratic Party are continuing to seize on the whole Project 2025 fallacy, because the new official Donald Trump RNC platform is so mainstream, it's so streamlined, it's been stripped of all the pork, of all the fat, of all of the exclusionary language for so many different communities, including mine, that, this is all the left has to grasp onto is 2025, because the official platform of the party is so current and up to speed with the needs of all Americans, including LGBT Americans. We give complete credit to that, to the leadership of the RNC and also to Donald Trump. So again, between his historical actions, I mean, as a businessman, he instituted policies of the Trump Organization that ensured domestic policy or partnership benefits before it was law in the state of New York. As a philanthropist, he talks extensively about, in the 80s, losing so many friends to HIV/AIDS. He was one of the first people to cut a 6-figure check to the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation before it was popular to do HIV/AIDS fundraising. And then again, as president of the United States, having so many different policies, things like ending the spread of HIV/AIDS in 10 years, things like going to the United Nations and calling upon the leaders of the world to end the criminalization of homosexuality, reducing the bans on sexually active gay men from giving blood. I mean, appointing amazing people, folks like Ambassador Rick Grinnell, people like Clark Cooper, people at the top and throughout the ranks of the government who are members of our community. He made it okay to be openly gay in the GOP, to live your life and to be a stellar employee, public servant, or political operative. So he created not only policy, but also conditions for equality in the Republican Party from top to bottom. And that is the lasting impact of Donald Trump that I'm so proud to share to the broader part of the LGBT community.
Yeah, the changes on this in recent years are pretty dramatic. I can remember back at CPAC in, I think, the late aughts, 2008, somewhere around there, a gay Republican organization, Go Proud, that was participating at CPAC, and it was a big catastrophe. There's a news cycle about it. There were a lot of some leaders of CPAC were very unhappy about it. It got criticized by other conservatives. Then there were certain people were defending them, and Ann Coulter got involved, and maybe you can recount that incident. But we've come such a long way since then.
Well, and this is the best part about where we are. I mean, I've been working professionally in politics for the better part of the last 20 years. I've seen the rapid advancement of inclusion, and this has happened. It's reflective of society. I mean, everybody has either, you know, a coworker who's a member of the community or somebody in their family. So these issues are real now to so many more people. And again, you know, politics flows downstream of society. As society goes, eventually, you know, politics will go, and that will still eventually hit the Republican Party. And that's where we are today. Those wars in the 2000s and even in the early teens were the last vestiges of people who were really trying to keep this movement and the party closed off to diversity. And I think, again, Donald Trump just brought an entirely new, fresh face. Look, there's always been gay people in the Republican Party at the highest levels. But when you actually make it okay for people to be their true selves, live their authentic lives, you're going to get the best work out of people. And that, again, is Donald Trump's focus. It's just valuing on what you give, valuing you on your impact to the organization, to the company, to the world. And that is, we saw just so much movement so quickly. And as a result of that, you know, again, we've seen this year so many disaffected Democrats and independents who are joining our movement. We created the Trump Unity Coalition to bring in not just, you know, LGBT conservatives and Republicans and our straight allies that are equality minded, but also those independents, those disaffected Democrats, people part of the Tulsi Gabbard world, part of the RFK Jr. world. We're working hand in hand. I brought in the RFK LGBT coordinator into Log Cabin so that we're working in sync. This is an entirely new way of conducting politics. It's not top down, it's bottom up. And I think it's part of the reason why Donald Trump right now is leading in the polls and why we have there's so much joy and energy and excitement at all of these events where it's doom and gloom and chaos on the left.
Got to leave it there for now, but we're going to continue this conversation and release more of it at a future date. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, viewers, for watching Rising today. We really appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll be back with you during vacation. I'll be back following week, not next week. You'll have Amber and others taking care of you then. See you later.